Hello. In the years that peaked, then ushered out the decade, Hammer reflected a roller coaster ride from frugality to recognition that cemented it firmly into the bedrock of fantasy and escapist cinema. By 1965, the Hammer machine was well and truly oiled, churning out year after year a host of genre movies of various lengths, fanfare and quality, but all with elements of the fantastical, dispensing with the pedestrian. They had finally found their feet. It's bread and butter. Universal Studios and Columbia Pictures, behemoths of cinematic art, had pulled out of Hammer Studios, and Hammer then dallied briefly with MGM but secured a bosom buddy with 20th Century Fox Studios, who agreed to partially fund all Hammer projects going forward. Hammer Studios by 1966 became more Spartan with its budgets, and in a penny-pinching exercise produced films back-to-back, often utilising the same sets, as well as shifting its entourage of thespians who jumped out of one costume into another to deliver varied performances and alternate roles. Bray Studios was also knocked on the head as they quite simply couldn't keep up with Hammer's demanding churn rate. Elstree Studios were used predominantly from 1964, and by 66 Bray was totally abandoned, completely, bar of course its legacy entrenched in Hammer's earlier years. Hammer thought big, aiming for the American markets, producing films such as 1 Million Years BC, which audiences lapped up, and most male cinema goers wanted to do lapping of their own to screen starlet Raquel Welch in That Bikini. To move with the heady perfume of permissiveness and the swing of it all, Hammer's output got that little bit more daring and a little bit more exploitative, including a much-needed update of the zombie genre, and to set this trend opened in January 1966 with a graphic wash of Kensington gore. By the close of the decade, the American cash flow was drying up, and Anthony Hines, executive producer in the 1950s and throughout the 60s, threw the towel in, leaving Hammer Studios' future looking very bleak indeed. Despite the ups and downs, Hammer gave us the stuff of dreams. Mini-epics, still pushing boundaries, still incurring the wrath of the censors, thankfully, and still braving it on the variety front, from the gothic and the gruesome to the prehistoric and the primitive, and then by 1969 blasted itself into a retro-futuristic cosmos, becoming a British institution, a brand synonymous with the thrills that, at the time, revved up the cinema enthusiast, and now, in this day and age, for a certain age group, shaped their childhood. Let's look and look again at the movies that shaped this period, shall we? Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. Whilst taking a vacation in the Carpathians, Charles Kent and his wife Diana, Kent's brother Alan, and his pretty wife Helen meet with the brusque Father Sandor, who advises them to avoid going to Carlsbad, their intended destination. They ignore his warning and end up getting dumped in the woodland by the coachman, They're temporarily rescued from abandonment and taken to a nearby castle where they meet their peculiar host called Clove. Clove says they can stay there until they work out a plan on how to carry on with their journey. Clove also informs them he is in fact a servant to his master, Count Dracula. That night, Alan is slaughtered and his blood is used to raise the Count from the inky black realms of the undead. At the script stage, Dracula Prince of Darkness caused the stuffy censors at Soho Square big wobbles. In an internal communication on the 19th of March 1965, they were in two minds whether the film could go into production at all, on grounds that it was far too disgusting for a British palate. Those elitist betters, like now, were highly offended, and as now, if the British Board of Film Censors are offended, you and I are forbidden to see it. They were especially appalled at the grisly murder of Alan Kent, bled like a stuck pig from his gashed trachea. Terence Fisher jumped to its defence, likening it to a sacred ritual. The censors chewed the fat and agreed it could stay in, on the proviso it would need to be toned down for an X certificate, and that the slitting should take place off camera. They also weren't too happy by Dracula seemingly delighting in choking Charles instead of the fly-eating, that it is a gratuitous piece of nastiness. When it came to Helen's staking, the British Board of Film Censors added, "We have always taken the line that we should not see stakes actually going into a vampire." Obviously, they had a lapse in memory, as a scene permitted in Brides of Dracula in 1960 did just that. Two other scenes, which the censor said were sadistic and quite disgusting, and should be entirely removed, are unknown as to what exactly they were referring to. In the denouement, plaster boards covered in salt material provides the illusion of frozen water. Dracula Prince of Darkness opened in January of 1966 and did quite well at the box office. When the film was exported to the Far East, it was known as the Bloody Scream of Dracula. The Daily Worker reported, after an exclusive invite to a 10-year of Hammer press event, that it was a sad occasion. Saddest of all was the contemplation of the Hammer Company's spectacular rise to power and prosperity through 10 years of trading in morbidity, putrefaction, and pain. Their first offering for 1966 is Dracula Prince of Darkness. For those who have suffered the worst excesses, it is a comparatively tame affair. The best version in high definition is the American Scream Factory Collector's Edition release. Superior to anything we have in the UK regarding audio and picture quality. It also features the UK and US release versions of the movie. The Canal Studios Optimum Blu-ray release from 2012 is well overdue for a restoration. Comparing the two. Starting out as Revenge of Dracula, this follow-up to the original 8 years after, is fun, but a bit of a letdown. It just seems rather lackluster in places. It was shot back-to-back with Rasputin the Mad Monk as part of a cost-cutting exercise, and Dracula Prince of Darkness is very much a by-the-numbers experience, seeing the usual group of bourgeoisie Victorians or Edwardians breaking down in the middle of nowhere and falling victim to the arch-vampire. A tried and tested method, which done well can be pulled off. However, it does need a bit of panache, and this Dracula vehicle doesn't quite get there. On the upside though, Andrew Keir, Philip Latham and Barbara Shelley pull this cinematic offering just above the mediocre. Highlights, or lowlights, depending on personal subjectivity, would be Shelley's transformation from the starchy to the sexy, culminating in what plays out very much like a ecclesiastical gang rape when she is held down and staked through the heart, being the ultimate form of penetration. There is also that wonderful bit of splatter where Terence Fisher tries so hard, bless him, to craft a shocking moment of exploitation within the constraints of censorship, flipping the rituals of pious dogma so we can actually see how it's done from a dark side perspective. Nice touches. Terence Fisher's lurid exploitation attempts triumph in his direction. The Count, despite his scant appearance during the film's running time, still draws in our attention, and Christopher Lee hissing his way through the proceedings still commands a sense of unease when he finally shows up. Dracula's welcome return deserves a princely 7 out of 10 from me. Visiting a local inn, a monk, Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine, Faith heals an innkeeper's wife by drawing out her fever with his bare hands. In a celebratory mood, Randy Rasputin attempts to fuck the innkeeper's daughter in a barn. In bursts her paramour, who loses his hand in a scuffle. Rasputin then attempts to rape the startled lass, but a small mob of villagers turn up, and Rasputin makes a quick exit through the roof. He is brought in front of the abbot, but refuses to apologise for his wicked deeds. Rasputin leaves for St. Petersburg. At a cafe in St. Petersburg, Rasputin wins a drinking match with his new friend Dr. Zargo, and gets in high spirits again, and busts a few rusky moves. A handmaiden to the Tsarina called Sonia, who witnesses this whilst out on a social with her friends. Sonia mocks Rasputin, but agrees to go to him personally to apologise for her mocking chortles. A day passes, and Sonia is somehow enchanted by the meeting with the monk, and seeks him out, where she finds Rasputin is lodging with Dr. Zargo. Sonia eventually gets a fill of Rasputin's beetroot and falls for him totally cockstruck. He fiendishly persuades her to cause an accident to the Tsarina's son. Still mesmerised by the monk, Sonia tells the Tsarina to call for Rasputin, who arrives at the palace and cures the Tsarevich. Delighted, the Tsarina sets up Rasputin with his own practice just outside the city. Dr. Zargo becomes perturbed by the influence Rasputin is having over the court. Rasputin eventually drives Sonia mad, and she eventually tops herself. Joining forces with Sonia's friends, Zargo intends to kill the heretic. But with the mysterious power Rasputin seems to wield over people, Dr. Zargo and co. will find it far from easy, dealing with a man who seems to have the powers of the devil himself. Utilising many of the sets seen in Dracula Prince of Darkness, the Russian Winter Palace for example was the Count's Castle, this was a new spin on Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's 1932 effort called Rasputin the Empress, which was also known as Rasputin the Mad Monk in the United Kingdom when it was released here. The original 1932 movie ran into difficulties as most of the characters portrayed in the 1932 version were still alive at the time and therefore were able to sue, which they did. Prince Yusupov had been awarded $1 million at the time, as although he admitted to murdering Rasputin, he successfully refuted and won his case that his wife had not been raped. To avoid repeating this, Hammer changed Yusupov to Keselov in this 1966 version. Barbara Shelley recalled Christopher Lee's spellbinding performance, which bordered on the intensely anodyne. She said the atmosphere on set was that when he finished, half the people on set were in a hypnotic trance. On the downside, Francis Matthews, playing Keselov, was rather pissed off after spending 2 days of the 6-week schedule filming a 5-minute fight scene, only for it to end up on the cutting room floor, with just a few glimpses of it making the final version. Christopher Lee received a bit of kudos in Variety publication at the time. One reviewer bleated, "Oh, he's a proper rascal, and this variation makes him a dancer." Which in fact was erroneous, as the upper half we see is indeed Christopher Lee, but the hot shoe shuffle of the bottom half belongs to a trained dancer. For one of the best high-definition releases, we could consider the UK Studio Canal Optimum release. A fine remastering which brings the hedonistic opulence of a pre-commie Russia to life. This also sports an enjoyable commentary with actors Christopher Lee, Suzanne Farmer, Francis Matthews and Barbara Shelley. Another pseudo-historical directed by Don Sharp, with a few touches of sadistic spice echoing Hammer's older films Terror of the Tongs and Stranglers of Bombay, but unlike these films made some 6 years before, is slightly more strained when it comes to the cruelty and the sadism, but it is there if you look for it. Rasputin the Mad Monk is a enjoyable slice of gothic melodrama, with Lee ditching the suave slick back with fangs for an on-screen creation of a rather hormone-enraged hobo, suitably gruff and grubby. Lee's performance pushes his co-stars into the shadows but never steals the limelight, with only screen siren Barbara Shelley being a rival contender who personifies neuroticism very well, especially when she finally goes off her trolley in her unmistakable Barbara Shelley way. Sharp really segregates the opulence of the bourgeoisie in comparison to the peasant lifestyle, and conveys Rasputin's transformation from fleabag to finery before our very eyes. And quite successfully he does so too. Hammer here confidently presents another monster, that of the humankind rather than the ethereal fabled beasties, and since they have now done away with the psycho-inspired thrillers for the rest of the decade, it is somehow a last hurrah. But fear not, viewer, as the House that Drip Blood develops a resurgence as we get into the 70s, but more of that later. Ideal for a late Friday night or a wet Sunday afternoon, this fulfilling watch enchanted me somewhat, so it gets a 7 out of 10. Nazdarovia.
Oh, those Russians.
I only know I have this power. I have always had it. I can feel it burning within me, driving me on. It is here inside me. It is in my hands. And I warn you all, that I, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, intend to use it. The power is mine, and I shall use it as I please.
In Cornwall in the 19th century, Dr. Peter Thompson is perturbed by a spate of mysterious deaths in the local mining community. What is also concerning is being blocked at every turn by the yokels when he wants to perform an autopsy. In a bit of a tiz, Thompson asks for the help of Sir James Forbes, his formal medical mentor from London, who hot-foots it down south with his daughter in tow called Sylvia. That night, Thompson's wife Alice, played by a sexually charged Jacqueline Pearce, 13 years before she became a household name as Blake Seven's Servalan, decides to go for a wander in a seemingly trance-like state. Intrigued, Sylvia follows her. Sylvia is intercepted by a gang of young men who take her to a local squire called Clive Hamilton. Hamilton, played by velvet-voiced John Carson, who if you close your eyes could be James Mason. Anyway, Hamilton intercepts the young men's sadistic taunting of Sylvia and apologises for their lack of chivalry. Before she goes, Hamilton warns her to have a care on her way home in the dark and watch out for collapsing tin mines dotted about the landscape. On her way back, Sylvia encounters a hideous-looking cadaver who is carrying Alice's corpse. It seems just as startled, and after making an unbearable otherworldly screech, drops Alice's lifeless body. The next day, Thompson and Forbes conduct an autopsy on Alice but find no hallmarks of foul play. However, they are shocked when they discover the blood in her veins bears no resemblance to anything human. Sir James reveals that someone in the village is practicing voodoo, and the empty coffins in the graveyard lead them to a cult of the black arts and a small legion of zombies. The voodoo priest's next intended victim is none other than Forbes' own flesh and blood. Another cost-effective back-to-back feature with the reptile sees the talents of John Gilling in the director's chair, at possibly his absolute best. This is Gilling's first foray into the purely horror genre for Hammer, who had previously showcased his talents on swashbucklers for the studio, films like The Scarlet Blade and Pirates of Blood River, dipping his toe slightly more into macabre waters with The Shadow of the Cat for Hammer. However, this is more of an old dark house gothic with a small breeze of horror blowing through it. With Plague of the Zombies, Gilling goes for a maelstrom. John Carson's performance is absolutely first class as Squire Hamilton, and he brings it to life with relish. Carson said of the role, "He was a two-dimensional character, but we weren't involved in a historical treatise of the threat of zombies to the Industrial Revolution. Sometimes when a script comes, a part just jumps out and says, 'Play me.' And by God, dear viewer, does Carson give this his all. The impressive and macabre zombie makeup, courtesy of Roy Ashton, must have been a nightmare for the actor wearing it. Ashton took pleats of tissue paper glazed with latex and applied it to the actor's face, then dredged it with powdery fuller's earth, a clay-like substance, and the veins were courtesy of fine blue cord. And then the icing on the cake were the white contact lenses with pinprick pupils to create a soulless, glowing stare, as if they are looking out at you from hell itself. The scariest looking dude has to be the lumbering cadaver who carries the lifeless Alice, and that odd scream is a chilling highlight in the film. The zombies here are just as iconic as Fulci's. Plague was slightly delayed in the production schedule due to an error with the Technicolor grading process. To earn its X rating, we witness a nifty decapitation and the uncomfortable scene of Sylvia being harassed by sweaty, lusty huntsmen, which if viewed is quite masochistically rapey. Thank God the Squire comes in when he does. Surprisingly, the Monthly Film Bulletin flipped their pictures and praised the movie in their 1966 review when they said, "Visually, the film is splendid. The script manages several offbeat strokes." When released stateside, The Plague of the Zombie was doubled up with Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and the marketing men offered the cinema goer free zombie eyes for the ladies and vampire fangs for the gents. To see The Plague of the Zombies in all its high-definition glory, the UK Blu-ray release on offer from Canal Studios' Optimum releasing label is a glorious print. The zombie transformation of Alice is a perfect example of how crystal clear and sharp the remastering is, and it's no surprise that the reds, blues and greens are intense as the movie could possibly sport, and rightly so for this absolute classic. Well, dear viewer, this has got to be one of my absolute favourites as a horror film and as part of Hammer's output, definitely in my top 20. The cast, Andre Morel, Jacqueline Pearce, John Carson, and the supporting cast are totally on point, with special mention to Pearce, whose screen interpretation of Alice succeeds in making the living dead uncomfortably sexy. Although Pearce only did one more Hammer film, if she had appeared in more than one, I would be confident in saying we would have had a rival to Barbara Steele. Such ethereal beauty, and an actress who, for genre fans, is sorely missed. John Gilling not only captures a post-colonial anxiety, but bridges the gap between the zombie slave films of the 1930s, like White Zombie for instance, and the modern-day nuclear age zombie horrors, such as Night of the Living Dead and the contemporaries in its wake. Whether Lucio Fulci saw Plague of the Zombies is not, as far as I know, noted, but the graveyard dream sequence, where the dead rise chillingly from the ground, is a strong echo of much the same thing in Zombie 2, 13 years later, except less sanguinary, of course. This sequence alone is so skillfully foreboding in the creepy way it's done. It's the only time I, as a small child of about 7, actually had nightmares when it was screened on late night TV many moons ago. I was absolutely captivated. Although censorship at the time would have prevented the remotest bit of gut munching and entrail ripping, and offering a strangulation instead, I'm sure given a more liberal approach could have culminated in such. Plague of the Zombies has it all: the direction, the acting, the musical score, the storyline, and the archetypical villainry, whether human or what once was human. In my humblest opinion, the drawbridge connecting one bygone era with the contemporary. A 10 out of 10 from me for this film. If I could give this more, I would do. This film opens in Cornwall as well, and sees Harry Spalding arrive with his wife Valerie to investigate the odd and somewhat sudden death of his brother. They get some help from Tom Bailey, the local pub landlord, and a local village weirdo called Mad Peter to piece together the mysterious puzzle. Mad Peter is found dead, poor bugger, frothing at the mouth and with a face as black as a coal miner's toenail. When Spaulding's brother is dug up and his demise recognised as the same, Tom Bailey believes the symptoms are similar to the results if someone is bitten by a venomous snake. Valerie befriends Anna Franklin, who seems slightly detached and seemingly petrified of her father, Dr. Franklin, who in turn seems to be controlled by his foreboding Malay manservant. Harry receives a letter from Anna, and in it she tells him that she is in great danger. Harry goes to Dr. Franklin's house, where he is attacked by a hideous reptilian monstrosity. What is a secret of the Franklin's house, and from what dark realms has this scaly fanged menace slithered from? The Reptile was filmed back-to-back with Plague of the Zombies and was again directed by Gilling. Roy Ashton was again to create the creature feature, which took him and Jacqueline Pearce up to 2 hours in makeup. A huge ordeal, especially for Pearce. God, how those actors suffered for their art. Pearce wore a basic structure of laminated paper from the base of her skull to the end of her nose. Ashton also took a cast of real snakeskin and moulded plastic scales to it, which covered Pearce's face. A dental cast of Pearce's teeth were also taken in order to create a bespoke set of reptilian fangs from which dribbled venom are made from glycerin. Despite their best efforts, Gilling and Ashton were only marginally pleased with the results, so Gilling chose to film the creature from the shadows, a similar remedy used by Terence Fisher in the film The Gorgon, and a lesson to all filmmakers: if your creature feature is below average, film from afar or from the shadows. Hammer decided to look into a relatively unknown genre of horror known as the Snake Woman film. This started in about 1912 with a film called The Reincarnation of Karma, where an Indian dancing girl was transformed into a huge serpent. In 1913, a film titled The Vampire featured the same plot, and 2 years later, in 1915, saw Heba, the snake woman, slither into view in a tale based on Aztec mythology. For 4 decades, the snake woman hibernated, but shed her skin and emerged in 1955's Cult of the Cobra, and 5 years later, in 1960, saw the snake woman appear, created by snake venom injected into the womb, ultimately creating rather a tragic heroine, destined to poison those unlucky enough to encounter her on the moors. Abroad, and examples of the genre were popular in Japan, with examples such as White Snake Woman from 1958 and 10 years later, The Snake Woman's Curse in 1968, being examples of what is known in the land of the rising sun as yokai, Japanese ghost stories. With a film called switching genders but still focusing on the tragic in 1973, another noteworthy entry is Ken Russell's 1988 Bram Stoker adaptation, The Lair of the White Worm. Another fine print in high definition, courtesy of Canal on their Optimum releasing label, in a restoration so beautiful you can count every scale and define every venomous drip. The Reptile is another triumph for John Gilling. Ashton brings up some effective death scenes, and although the reptile makeup is a tad on the crude side, Gilling works around this with some very moody, chimerical camera work. Unsettling really, as none of us like things that leap out of the dark. The supporting cast is strong, with a surprising appearance by Dad's Army's John Laurie, who is doomed from the get-go really, and ends up with a suitably grisly demise. John Gilling again brings us an anti-colonial stance where those big bad white westerners bring back with them a curse, best left alone if it wasn't for their superiority complex and meddling with Johnny Foreigner. The reptile is a claustrophobic pop of Gothica with a soupçon of slime evident in the exhumation of Harry's brother in a rain-soaked graveyard, and a bit of sleaze with an ending bordering on the incestuous. But as we know, dear viewer, there is nothing as close as a Cornish brother and sister, or in this case father and daughter. A plausible in-joke? Who knows? Therefore, this accomplished little offering gets a 9 hisses out of 10 Viper lovers. In the early days of Mother Earth, there lived a tribe called the Rock People, who resided in caverns built into a cliff, a safer space to avoid the flesh-hungry creatures that they live with side by side. This crude colony are ruled by their chief, Akoba. Akoba had 2 sons, Tumak and Sakana, but like Cain and Abel, they are sworn enemies in a perpetual game of one-upmanship and sibling rivalry. When Tumak fights with his brother, the consequence is banishment from his tribe. Cast out into the wilderness, Tumak encounters a ferocious lizard monster and battles a brontosaurus. Tumak, exhausted, finally collapses onto a beach. His small respite doesn't last for long though, as he's attacked by a snapping giant turtle. Tumak nearly loses his life, but is rescued by another tribe called the Shell People. The Shell People have an advanced civilization in comparison to his, and their knowledge of medicines and natural remedies heal the wearily injured stranger. Tumak gains their trust when he slaughters a feisty Allosaurus, but after a punch-up with their chieftain called Ahot, Tumak is cast out yet again. A woman belonging to the Shell People called Lahana is fascinated by him and his feelings for this stranger, and she decides to leave her tribe to follow him, as Tumak, now recovered, seeks revenge on his people. After avoiding becoming caught in the crossfire of a battle between a Triceratops and Ceratosaurus, they arrive at the caves of the Rock People. Tumak attempts for the position of the tribal leader, wounding Sakana, his brother, in the process. Meanwhile, Lahana is carried off by a pterodactyl, but fortunately for her, the creature drops her into the sea. Lahana then returns to Tumak, but brings a small entourage of Shell People with her, which is the catalyst in a tribal fight for supremacy and survival, as tribe goes against tribe, and Mother Nature goes against the first of humankind, as a volcano erupts around the carnage, wanting to bring this era of mankind to an end in an inferno of flames and natural disaster. This movie is a reimagining of 1 Million BC made in 1940. It was a film that starred Victor Mature and Lon Chaney Jr. The exquisitely arid landscapes of Lanzarote and Gran Canaria were used extensively. The picture cost Hammer around £400,000, which is just over $6 million in today's money. Welsh had already appeared in another exemplary slice of retro sci-fi with The Fantastic Voyage, and had jumped straight from that project into this one after being approached to do so by Richard Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, who were Hammer's backers stateside. Welsh was itching to go to London anyway to further her career, and so accepted, but said she also only took the role because nobody will remember this thing, I can shove it under the carpet. Little did she know that with a fervid marketing campaign, it would result in one of Hammer's biggest smashes. The cast spent most of the time shadowboxing with imaginary dinosaurs, but this flat dynamic altered when Ray Harryhausen's dinosaurs were matted in after. What fantastic creations they are. Raquel Welch recollected, "They told us exact eye lines. When you were doing it, it seemed ridiculously silly." Another silly thing affecting Don Chaffee, the director, was him struggling with the lack of a verbal script, which proved a headache to Chaffee, who had to try and make sense of a load of gibberish and grunts, but got some idea of the lingo eventually and used key phrases regularly throughout, such as Akita, which means an expression of alarm, and Nietzsche, meaning no. Raquel Welch's voice was dubbed by Nicolette Mackenzie, who also freelanced to provide the dub for Ursula Andress in the film Dr. No. Shooting of the interiors happened at EMI Studios at Boringwood. Welch and co-star Martine Bezic were unimpressed by stunt doubles in their action cat fight and decided to do it themselves, and the result is pretty good as far as cat fights go. 1 Million Years BC became one of Hammer's most successful movies, and by 1972 had grossed an estimated $3.6 million at the box office, which is about $57.5 million as of 2021, 9 times the movie's budget. Inspired by this film, Ray Harryhausen wanted to strike a deal and do a version of King Kong. Hammer was on board, but the copyright holders were not. Dinosaurs were put back on the menu, and a sequel to this film was being explored, whilst the film spawned Hammer's own meta-franchise, which is like I would call it the prehistoric exotica genre. And this saw Martine Bezic take the lead role in the very next Hammer production. Oh, and for Doctor Who fans, if you were thinking where you had seen that wonderful bikini before, it's the one worn by Claire Jenkins, who plays the role of Nanina in a story for Doctor Who called The Savages, that is now sadly missing from the archives. The best version to go for this is the USA Kino Lorber release for a mesmerising high-definition print that's struck from the 4K negative. They've done a really good job at remastering this. It certainly makes for an astounding print, as well as featuring the UK and US cut in this package. With this film, on the downside, you have a plot which can sometimes come across as slightly incomprehensible. It was a brave move for Hammer to add a bit of cinema verite to the film with a dialogue-less angle it was aiming for. However, this does seem to hamper the movie on screen. What saves the day, though, is Ray Harryhausen's effects of the dinosaurs, which must have seen cutting edge for its time and really continued until the 1980s. Fortunately, Hammer here got a genius who is at the top of his game, and those sorely needed episodes of dinosaur mayhem help this from just being a bland adventure drama. However, despite its negatives, the film is ideal for those who enjoy boys' own adventure jollity, but is blemished by a little too much padding and at times much ado about nothing. 7 out of 10. Darkest Africa, and a hunter named David Marchant enters uncharted territory and into the realms of the White Rhino tribe. Marchant is captured by the natives and taken to their temple, where he is due to be sacrificed. A sudden flash of lightning and time stands still, and Marchant escapes from his doom by passing into another world through an opening in the temple walls that revealed this beautiful, in a 1960s synthetic way, forest. Marchant meets a girl with blonde hair and animal skins, but is then captured by the dark-haired Amazon tribe and taken back to be enslaved. Marchant finds himself at the mercy of the evil queen, the amply bosomed Kari. Kari has also enslaved the blonde-haired girl David met and wants David to be her mate. At first, Marchant refuses, but then realises he could use this to his advantage. Marchant will use this opportunity to free the slaves and lead a rebellion against this titanically tittied tyrant. Marchant will also face the agonizing dilemma of having to go back to his own time and space, but will this mean leaving forever the blonde-haired woman David has found himself to be falling madly in love with? Prehistoric Women began as slave women of the White Rhino, then Prehistoric Women. This B-movie was shot on the empty sets of 1 million years BC, which was just coming to an end and was in the last stages of post-production. The film was released to a small cinema-going audience in 1966 and was marketed with the title Slave Girls. It wasn't until 1968, 2 years later, that Prehistoric Women was sent on a larger distribution circuit, mainly as a double bill with the infinitely superior The Devil Rides Out. This is where the monthly film bulletin saw it and said of the movie that, not surprisingly, it had been left on the shelf for a couple of years. Martine Bezic took the part of Kari. She was Jamaican-born in the year 1941. Bezic was chosen for the part after Michael Carreras, the director of this film, was so impressed by her acting ability and her screen presence when she starred alongside Welsh in 1 Million Years BC that he asked her to take the lead in this film. He may have also been impressed by her other small parts in the role of a Bond girl in the films From Russia with Love and Thunderball. Earning the nickname of Battling Bezic due to her prehistoric prowess and concerning her lead role in Prehistoric Women, Bezic said, "I took the ball and ran with it," or "I took the whip and ran with it." It was an amusing premise for a film, a society of women who dominate men. The funniest thing of all, though, was here we were in this lost civilization, and everyone has a British accent. Prehistoric Women, or Slave Girls, call it what you want to, is not available on high definition in the United Kingdom currently, so it's DVD only. The Region 2 release, courtesy of Optimum Releasing, is currently the best way. For me, Prehistoric Women is garish B-movie irreverence at its most two-dimensional, a showcase for Bezic, if nothing else, with the dashing lead played by Michael Latimer. Now, he starred in many a cult film or TV show, and of course the daughter of famous food critic Egon Ronay, Edina, as his love interest. These two thespians are the only others of interest to note. Hammer tries to make a kind of statement at the emerging women's lib by having a tribe of women with the males as their slaves, but as it's 1966, it just means plenty of cleavage, fur bikinis, and a very tepid sub-dom relationship between the oppressed males and the female oppressors. So it really does become a male fantasy anyway, and the message of female emancipation is soon lost in the mists of it all. It does make for good eye candy, though. It's a rather third-rate affair, mixing abandoned studio sets and African stock footage to pad out the running time. There were two different edits. The print entitled Slave Girls was 75 minutes and Prehistoric Women was the full 90-minute version, so I'm wondering if the 75-minute version would quicken the pace and be the better of the two. With no reptilian menace looming at the actors and the only revered creature, a white rhino, which is wheeled into shot when it needs a bit of animation, this is pretty crapola, even for 1966, making Prehistoric Women a lame slipshod affair, even for a B-movie, so it has the lowest rating so far, at 4 out of 10.
What makes you so cruel?
Cruelty has made me cruel. I was once their slave. Before the devils came, we Dark Ones were in bondage to the Fair Ones. You would have pitied me then, a meek, cringing creature. You would have pitied me, but you would not have wanted me.
I don't want you now.
Why not? Must a woman always be subservient to a man to be wanted?
No.
Do you suggest we should be equals?
Yes.
Then I offer you equality. Share my throne and my kingdom with me.
If you abandon the harshness of your regime, yes, I could accept your offer.
You see? Already you want to impose your will. You want to dominate me. I'd be a fool to let any man do that again. But you will want me. And on my terms.
Never.
I am queen here. I will not be denied.
You will never rule me.
Gwen Mayfield returns to England to take up the position of the headmistress of a rural school. Mayfield has returned from Africa, recovering from a nervous breakdown, which was caused by a juju man. The private school is run by oddball Alan Bax, who wanders around in a priest's get-up, fulfilling a childhood dream of priesthood, and it's also run by Stephanie, his sister, who is a reporter and has a fascination with the occult. Mayfield settles down to village life, but notices the community lives in disdain over a relationship between Mayfield's star pupil, Ronnie Dowsett, and the relationship he has with a shy village girl called Linda Rigg, who we also learn is being bullied by her peculiar grandmother, who is very much into the old ways. Ronnie becomes very ill and his condition worsens. A headless doll is found by the schoolchildren, stuck with pins. Gwen gets twitchy about this. Could the two events be related? When Ronnie's father dies from drowning and bad luck prevails, Gwen probes further and finds evidence of witchcraft. Gwen decides to speak out about this at an inquest, but begins to be plagued by nightmares of voodoo and the black arts, leading to another breakdown. Gwen begins to realise she is in the clutches of a witch's coven whose intentions are to sacrifice Linda Rigg in a bargain with the dark powers for immortality. It was Nigel Kneale who wrote the screenplay to the film The Witches. He, like most of the people involved in the production of Hammer films, often kept their oar in with the studio, and one can see the many famous faces, directors and writers crop up in a gamut of cult television and film productions of the time. The Witches was written by Peter Curtis, a nom de plume for the real writer Nora Lofts, and its original title was called The Devil's Own, a title which was used to market the film in America, as at the time another film was being released with the same title. Betty Davis had proven so popular with a role in the film The Nanny, Hammer decided to woo another classic actress to help draw in the crowd, so Joan Fontaine was asked. Fontaine is a sister of Olivia de Havilland, and they reputedly hated each other's guts. Fontaine agreed, providing her salary was inflated and she had a share in the film's profits at the box office. Fontaine also had a vested interest, as she had bought the film rights to the book in 1962, suitably impressed by the novel. Cyril Frankel was asked to direct the picture after he met Hammer producer Anthony Hines whilst working on the ITC series called The Baron. Frankel was still remembered after his impressive but controversial film Never Take Sweets from a Stranger from 1961. Frankel got on well with Fontaine and got the job with her seal of approval. The film was submitted to the British Board of Film Censors at script stage and was awarded an A certificate, which would be the kiss of death for a horror film. To bump the adult thrills up a bit to the desired X rating, grotesque scenes of yokel bacchanalia were filmed, involving oil smearing, sexual suggestion, and what looks like mud and worm eating. I hope that's meant to be sod and not shit. Frankel was not happy about this, but grudgingly agreed to film it nevertheless. Despite something for the thrill seeker in the audience, a well-established actress in the lead role, and a decent production, it bombed at the box office. Fontaine was devastated, and this ended up being her last role. The cinema goer didn't like it, and the critics were in two minds. The Monthly Film Bulletin said of it, a very enjoyable thriller. The atmosphere of horror is cunningly built up out of the tranquil village landscape, which I agree with, whilst the Kinematograph Weekly thought it was a well-made picture in many ways, which fails to make the grade. Vibrancy throbs in the hues drawn from the mighty oaks and the bucolic rural colours should you acquire the Canal Studio release of this in the UK, and it is currently the best Blu-ray release to go for. The Witches is something of a pioneer in folk horror, made a couple of years prior to the Witchfinder General, 4 years before Robin Redbreast, and 7 years before The Wicker Man. But unlike these, The Witches is a fusion of voodoo and witchcraft, avoiding a staunchly pagan offering. Frankel opts for a claustrophobic setting with sinister occult simmerings underneath, presented to us in the quirky characters that live in the village, with Duncan Lamont playing a slightly unhinged butcher, and an early appearance by Leonard Rossiter as a slightly sinister doctor. There is unease and things are very unsettled throughout the picture, little simmerings though, as though the beauty of a chocolate box village of the past and a simpler pace of life is a mere facade, a veil of something much more sinister should this veil be ripped away. None of this is not helped, of course, by Joan Fontaine's neurosis and paranoia, but instead of sensationalism and bold gesturing, Frankel settles to achieve this in an understated way, which for me added to the creepiness. Mention has also got to be made with regards to Kay Walsh, who reminded me so much of Noelle Gordon, and she's another highlight as Fontaine's nemesis.
Grow me a gown with golden down. Cut me a robe from toe to lobe. Give me a skin for dancing in. Of course, it won't be pleasant, and I loathe the idea of it, but it's the necessary ritual.
Though her warbling of some of the incantations is unintentionally amusing. Overall, I feel it's a shame that The Witches is brushed over and swallowed up by the other films around it in this period, as it does not get quite the praise it deserves, and the Bacchanalia sequence is quite sleazy-queasy, but very restrained in what could have been. 7 broomsticks out of 10 from me. It would have been an 8, but I felt a little bit let down by the ending. A slight cop-out. Oh, my giddy aunt, dear viewer, it's at the time I had no idea how indulgent we would be with Hammer's output for 1966, so we will have one more from the start of 67, and we can look and look again at some more in my next part. So to round it off, I am pleased to say, The Baron is back. Baron Frankenstein is experimenting to see if the soul can exist after death. The Baron plans to freeze his body, then with help resurrect it. He is brought back to life by his young assistant Hans and his confidant Dr. Hertz. To celebrate the victory over death, Hans is sent into the village to buy some champagne, but Cleve, the cafe owner, refuses Hans any credit. Hans leaves Cleve an expensive overcoat he was given by Dr. Hertz until he can return with some capital. On the way back, Hans defends his love, Christina, Cleve's daughter, when she's verbally abused and taunted by a gang of 3 hoorays who take the piss out of her disfigurement. Hans, in retaliation, gets into a scuffle and wounds one of the plummy-mouthed wankers. The 3 hoorays end up at Cleve's cafe and murder him. Hans gets the blame and is found guilty based on the coat being found at the scene of the crime. Christina witnesses her beloved being guillotined, already aware he did not murder her father. Overcome by the death of her father and now her lover, Christina commits suicide by drowning herself in the nearest stream. Frankenstein obtains both their bodies and with the help of Dr. Hertz transfers the soul of Hans into the body of Christina. Frankenstein also cosmetically rectifies Christina's blemishes, making her a creation of pure beauty. What Frankenstein has also created is an avenging angel, simmering with hate and fueled by revenge. Christina wants retribution on the three who got her love executed, and sets about to butcher them. Playboy magazine's Miss August of 1966 was Polish-born Susan Denberg, who takes the lead here and does a decent job in creating a anti-Eve for her role as Christina. Fortunately, her character is not just relegated to the fluttering of a false eyelash and the glimpse of a tit. Christina is certainly not your stereotypical 60s bimbo. Denberg does not have the gravitas of her other Hammer glamour queens like Barbara Shelley or Ingrid Pitt, who was waiting in the wings. However, she can hold her own, clearly. Denberg also appeared in the Star Trek episode Mud's Woman prior to this movie. Denberg's portfolio is very Spartan, and this film is possibly her only crowning glory in a very short career. It's a shame, really, as it would have been great to see her in other things. Those of you seeing the scintillating images of our Baron carrying his creation in a bikini around his laboratory will be sorry to learn that this does not happen in the film at all, as this was all snapped in the name of publicity, another one of those fabulous Hammer marketing ploys to draw in the punters. Thorley Walters is endearing as Dr. Hertz and teams up superbly with Peter Cushing. Walters goes for a eccentric, bumbling father figure character, especially when it comes to the way that Christina is nurtured by him and Frankenstein to a lesser extent. Composer James Bernard provides an excellent score with this picture and aims for a more romantically themed accompaniment which tugs at the heartstrings when it wants to, and the film is certainly not void of evocative and emotional instances worthy of it. Frankenstein Created Woman deals with more deeper topics on a metaphysical level, and thankfully Terence Fisher is back behind the lens to realise it, avoiding the schlocky and airy-fairy tempo of Freddie Francis's directorial style previously in The Evil of Frankenstein, where the Grand Guignol was switched for a somewhat gaudy commercialism. Fisher brings us a film with some challenging topics for the time, life after death and controversially gender switching, which Joe Public in 1967 were still getting their head around. Don't forget the liberalisation of the swinging 60s only happened to a certain demographic, and the majority of people were still emerging out of the provincial chrysalis that was the 1950s. The exploitational element of the Avenging Angel style of film kind of started here and reached a boiling point with exceptional grindhouse milestones in the 1970s and 80s, such as the likes of I Spit on Your Grave and Abel Ferrara's Miss 45. Frankenstein Created Woman is not available in the UK on Blu-ray or in high definition. This is a bloody disgrace as far as I'm concerned. So we have to rely on the superb release from Scream Factory, which has been lovingly restored, and you can really get the full impact of Arthur Grant's cinematography. A total triumph, in my opinion, especially with the collaboration he had with director Terence Fisher. However, for UK fans, this is a considered purchase when you take into consideration the cost of shipping, etc., and having to acquire a multi-region Blu-ray player to play it on. Such a faff. An absolute travesty that this hasn't been picked up yet by a distributor for the UK in 2021 for a high-definition release. But us Brits are always a bridesmaid and never the bride when it comes to cinema, whether it's to do with the availability of a film or our draconian censorship laws. Well, Martin Scorsese has been reputed to say that this is one of his favourite films, and thankfully for this outing, the Baron is back with his rightful director, Mr. Fisher. The Baron here is less rakish than Fisher's first two outings, and shows through Peter Cushing's skills glimpses of compassion, especially for his creation. However, there is still that streak of callousness in the quest for playing God, where this time the Baron tampers with the psyche rather than the surgical. The Baron is on the outside a lot of the time in this movie, and despite being the main instigator, Fisher tends to focus more on the plight of poor Christina. This is pretty solid stuff from all concerned, and I can see why this is quite popular amongst Hammer enthusiasts and cinema goers alike at the time. After being absent for 3 years from our screens, this film is most certainly a noteworthy return for the Baron, and continuing with the franchise, which, bar one Frankenstein movie, features Peter Cushing, who, as always, is fantastic. Sorry, viewer, but whatever he's in will always get praise from me, as he's one of my favourite actors, so excuse the slight bias towards him and Christopher Lee. They are, after all, my childhood heroes. The Financial Times review summed this up in one hit. Frankenstein created woman has something that holds you, despite yourself. A certain dash and audacity, the severed heads, the callous guillotining of the hero, the beautiful bloody murderess, letting rip with a hatchet or carving knife, and the occasional striking composition in this picture, which leaves Terence Fisher without a rival in the Hammer school. I couldn't agree with this anymore. Frankenstein Created Woman gets a 9 out of 10 from me.
It's been tampered with. The screws are loose. There you are. Where's the head?
I have done what you told me. What am I to do now?
You will kill Johann. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him.
Well, there we have it, dear friends. I'm going to have to love you and leave you now, as I have taken up quite enough of your time. So please tune in to Look, Look and Look Again next time for some of this.
Shirley, my dear, would you mind sitting somewhere else? Body odor offends me.
Some of this. And this.
The goat of Mentis. The devil himself.
Until next time on Look, Look and Look Again. Cheerio. Yeah.